A few things are certain in this life: death, taxes, and inflation. And Arsenal never winning the Champions League. Inflation is the gradual rise in prices, which can be translated as the decline of purchasing power over time by citizens of a certain country. Uh, Inflation sucks. I still find myself complaining over the fact that a smoky pasua is 35 shillings. I'm like, how did you even get here? But that's inflation for you. It is inevitable. So the cost of power in Kenya just went up, and court cases have already been filed to stop the implementation of these new tariffs. So as from 1st of April 2023, the base unit price per kilowatt hour for the Kenyan consumer rose from 10 shillings to 12 shillings and 22 cents for the 0 to 30 kilowatt hour usage band, from 10 shillings to 16 shillings and 30 cents for the 31 to 100 kilowatt hour usage band, and from 15 shillings and 80 cents to 20 shillings and 97 cents for the over 100 kilowatt hour usage band. So why the new prices? Is it the unrelenting march of inflation? Is it corporate greed from Kenya Power? Or is it a justified price adjustment? So for those of us that are complaining about the new prices, are our complaints valid? So in this video we'll ask, is electricity in Kenya really that expensive? Or are we complaining over nothing? So let's dive in. So I did a comparative analysis on the cost of power in the East African region, pitting Kenya against her neighbors. And here are the results. Please note that these are base unit tariffs, and additional charges such as fuel levies and taxes have not yet been factored in. Also note that these are consumer electricity tariffs and that different countries have different usage bands. Kenya has the most expensive electricity in the 0 to 30 kilowatt hour usage band all across East Africa. The only usage band where Kenyans pay less per unit than Tanzanians is the 76 to 100 kilowatt hour usage band. Uganda does pose an interesting outlier, where it incentivizes consumers to fall into the 81 to 150 kilowatt hour usage band, which is sandwiched either side by more expensive usage bands. They actually call it the cooking tariff. Kenya could introduce a cooking tariff, but some research shows that only 41 kilowatt hour units on average are used in electric cooking in Kenya. Kenyans pay 4 shillings more per unit than Ugandans in the 0 to 15 kilowatt hour usage band. However, Kenyans pay less than Ugandans in the 16 to 80 kilowatt hour usage band. On average, Rwanda has the most expensive electricity across board in the region, with Kenya coming in at second, Uganda third, Tanzania fourth, and Ethiopia fifth. Ethiopia is an outlier, perhaps the biggest outlier in the history of all outliers. We'll discuss power in Ethiopia in greater detail very soon in another video. But back to Kenya. So to the question, is electricity in Kenya expensive? Yes, definitely yes. So what are the reasons? The first reason we look at is obligations to meet revenue targets and turn adequate profit. We must remember that Kenya Power is a listed company on the Nairobi Securities Exchange. While the government still holds 50.1%, the remaining 49.9% is traded on the NSE. Every shareholder is entitled to a favorable return on the investment, and that includes investors in Kenya Power. It is a mandate of any company and its top leadership to ensure the best return on investment for the shareholders is realized. Kenya Power has a revenue requirement every financial year. This revenue requirement needs to be fulfilled in order for the company to meet its running costs, meet its growth and expansion plans, pay for the power that it purchases, and pay dividends to shareholders. This is a table of projected required revenue over the next 5 financial periods. Remember back when you had cheap power in 2022? Well, this was because of the implementation of a 15% base rate tariff reduction recommended by a presidential task force. While the lower power bills were a great reprieve for many Kenyans, the tariff reduction led to a revenue shortfall of over 26 billion shillings. It's also worth noting that no dividend was paid out to shareholders for the financial year 2021-2022 occasioned by the revenue shortfall. So in order to generate more revenue, to outpace growing expenses and turn profit to fulfill shareholder obligations, tariffs have to increase. So remember, the higher the tariff, the higher the revenue, the higher the profits, and consequently the higher the dividend paid out.
This is the way.
The second reason we look at is the rise of the independent power producers. The cocktail of power we consume as a country consists of hydroelectric power, geothermal power, wind power, thermal power, solar power, as well as imported power. Each power plant has different setup and running costs depending on the type of power they want to produce. The construction, commissioning, and operationalization of a power plant is a very expensive and very capital-intensive affair. The government, realizing the need to address this shortfall in capital, opened up the energy generation subsector to some much-needed private investments. And perhaps the best example is the Lake Turkana Wind Power Project, which is the single largest private investment in Kenya. It provides low-cost clean energy to the national grid and currently makes up between 15 to 17% of our total installed capacity at any one time. However, most of the IPPs produce the much more expensive thermal power. Thermal power is produced by burning natural gas or LNG, diesel and other heavy fuels. So the overall cost of thermal power is entirely dependent on the prevailing cost of fuel. The rising fuel prices have led to much more expensive power in our grid. Guaranteed profit margins written into the IPP contracts ensure that any increase in fuel prices is entirely absorbed by Kenya Power and consequently by you, the consumer. This is not a wholesale vilification of all IPPs, as KenGen also runs several thermal power plants, and just like in the IPPs, their fuel costs are also passed down on to you. According to the last reported data from Kenya Power in 2022, we witnessed a 637 gigawatt-hour jump in the purchase of the much more expensive thermal power. This was a 68% increase from the previous year. The cumulative fuel costs alone during this period rose by around 16 billion shillings from 12 billion shillings to over 28 billion shillings. In the same reporting period, we also saw a decline in the purchase of the much cheaper hydroelectric power by a factor of 793 gigawatt hours. This was a 20% drop from the previous year. I would mainly attribute this to low water levels in the dams occasioned by depressed rainfall over that period. In some good news, there was a 352 gigawatt hour jump in the purchase of clean, cheap wind energy, which was a 20% increase from the previous year. This was attributed to Kipeto Wind Power in Kajiado being added on to the national grid. The same period also saw a 72% increase in cheap net electricity imported, which was a factor of 141 gigawatt hours. However, the cost burden of the rising fuel prices was more than enough to weigh down the gains made in the purchase of cheaper energy by Kenya Power. The third reason we look at is the weakening shilling. The power purchased by Kenya Power from the IPPs is paid to them in US dollars. The weakening shilling means that Kenya Power needs more shillings to buy the same number of dollars in order to pay for the power they purchase from the IPPs. The weakening shilling also means that there are big losses on forex attributed to servicing of loans, especially from external lenders. In the financial year 2021-2022, Kenya Power lost over 6.5 billion shillings in financing costs alone, occasioned by the Kenya shilling's depreciation against the US dollar and the euro in their loan book. Kenya Power actually tried to have large commercial and industrial customers to start paying their power bills in dollars and euros to cushion them from forex losses. This move was, however, rejected by IPRA. Did you know that nearly 25% of the power purchased by Kenya Power is lost in system losses? This amounted to 2,839 gigawatt hours lost during transmission in the financial year 2021-2022. Some of these are unavoidable technical losses and can be attributed to the constraints of the laws of physics. Some are incidental technical issues, while others are infrastructure inefficiencies. For instance, while AC seems like it won the transmission wars, DC is a more efficient power transmission method, especially over long-haul distances. Implementing DC over AC will see a drop of close to 10% in the system losses incurred in transmission, bringing the losses closer to the globally acceptable benchmark of around 15%. A 10% reduction in system losses could see cost savings of over 10 billion shillings. Just a quick look at Kenya Power's customer care Twitter handle reveals just a small fraction of the technical problems the monopoly utility company is constantly facing. There are always around 5 regions with reported and scheduled power blackouts at any one time. Most of these regions have perennial recurring outages that never seem to get resolved. Add on to that, there are unreported regions experiencing blackouts as well as regions with scheduled power outages. Some of these inefficiencies have made us normalize having the occasional nationwide blackout or blackouts every time it starts raining. This is unacceptable for a country that does not experience violent storms or cyclones. This means that there exists unaddressed critical single point of failure vulnerabilities, as well as massive problems with the resilience of the grid infrastructure to something as harmless as a 2-minute drizzle or a monkey at a substation. The rollout of lifeline maintenance to cut down on power outages has been regularly touted by Kenya Power, but its impact is yet to be realized on the ground. These inefficiencies eventually lead to higher tariffs being levied on the consumer to cater for the huge power transmission losses as well as losses of uncollected revenue occasioned by power outages. So now that we've identified that electricity in Kenya is expensive, are there interventions that can be made to bring down the cost?